Deserts. We know them, we love them, so let's just jump into it. The first big question is, where should you put your deserts? To do this as realistically as possible, it's best if you have the landforms of the entire world built already. That's because this is a scientific question, and so I'll go over how it works on Earth. Deserts form where there's not a lot of precipitation, and there are a bunch of factors that contribute to this, mostly currents, mountains, and latitude. A lot of people know about the rain shadow effect. When a mountain range stands between an area and a nice, warm, and moist breeze, the breeze will get deflected upwards by the mountains. It'll get colder and it'll drop the moisture it's carrying as rain or snow. But the wind keeps going, and once it reaches the other side of the mountain range, it's totally dry. Rinse and repeat this for years and years, and you'll end up with a desert on the leeward side of the mountains, or in a basin. The Patagonian and Mojave deserts are good examples of this. So then, where do nice, warm, moist breezes come from? Well, some of you may know about the global currents. They differ in temperature based on where they're coming from. Warm currents create a lot of clouds and precipitation. That's why Britain always looks like this. You got that warm Gulf Stream. Cold currents don't create weather like that, so lands around them won't get nearly as much rainfall. Artifexion has an amazing video on creating currents. Check it out. This is what caused the formation of the Atacama Desert, which is made even drier by a rain shadow effect from the Andes. And here's the big one: global pressure belts. High pressure tends to push weather away from it. Low pressure does the opposite. The Earth has bands of high pressure around 30 degrees latitude, so you get a lot of deserts around that area. And I hear you saying, wait, Jacksonville, Florida is 30.332 degrees north and 81.656 degrees west, and that's not a desert.
Explain yourself.
We'll take a look around the currents around there. Warm, hot, damn. You got that warm Gulf Stream. Deserts are also more likely to form if they're away from large bodies of water, because coastal winds will bring in a bit of moisture. All of these factors should be taken into account when creating deserts. But that's not it, because it goes deep. The Sahara is probably like the desert, the big one. It's likely the most influential desert when it comes to world building. Some of you may know that it was a tropical grassland over 6,000 years ago. Well, how does that happen? About 10,000 years before that, the Earth had a different tilt due to the way the Earth wobbles. The axial tilt, which is the reason we have seasons, is currently 23.5 degrees. It was 24.1 degrees back then. However large this difference seems to you is how much you know about this stuff, because that's pretty big. A larger tilt means harsher seasons as you go up in latitude, more tropical lands, less polar land, and less water in the ice caps. Although the high pressure belts at 30 degrees most likely stayed close by. All this means that the area of the Sahara got more sunlight. And you'd think that would make it warmer and make it more of a desert, but no. This sunlight made it easier for grass to grow there. The fact that the region had vegetation made it much easier for it to retain water, as water evaporated from the grass and pretty quickly would fall back down to earth. Eventually, the tilt became less dramatic, which gave the Sahara less sunlight, which caused the grass to not do as well and not retain as much water, and the region became a desert. And there's also a theory that humans' livestock helped to quicken the feedback loop that caused the Sahara to desertify again. So when placing your deserts on your map, you'll probably want to have mountains and global currents in place. But if you're not too keen on doing that yet, I got you. You'll just have to assume some of the characteristics of the planet are similar to that of Earth. When it comes to currents, you see a lot of cold ones to the west of big continents. Center your deserts around 30 degrees latitude and put a few in the center of the largest land masses. All in all, it's important to have realistic locations for deserts, but in world building, you can never really say with 100% certainty that there should or shouldn't be a desert right there. So you do have a bit of flexibility here, but that doesn't mean that you should ignore the science behind it. Now let's talk about the mountains and rock formations of deserts. You've all seen those structures in Arizona, the plateaus and arches and stuff. How do those happen? There's a unique type of erosion in deserts because it's not water that's primarily eroding everything, it's sediments being carried by the wind. Because wind and water carve into stone differently, arches and tall pillars can happen frequently in deserts where they can't anywhere else. The erosion process also creates plateaus. The strongest rock layers, like those made up of sandstone, limestone, basalt, and quartzite, don't erode very easily, so you get a flat top composed of those layers. Some places can't keep any soil and just lay as barren rocklands, usually called badlands. So now that you have a basic layout of your deserts, what challenges are there to living in one? This is the single question that will determine how you should build everything regarding these regions, and it'll depend on the biology of the people that you're focusing on. But for now, let's just stick to how deserts and humans interact. It's often very difficult to live in real-world deserts due to a lot of things. This means that any outsiders in a harsh desert area should have to consult with natives or guides or something, else they'll be in for a rough time. First and foremost, most real-life organisms need water to survive. Deserts don't have that. Not a lot of it anyways. So things that need water that live in a desert are gonna have to be adapted. For plants, this means wide and shallow roots, minimized surface area, places to store water, a waxy covering to reduce water loss and reflect heat, long periods of dormancy, and maybe some spikes in toxicity to it so animals don't steal your water. I basically just described a cactus. The system works, everybody!
Well, if it works.
Other plants try to tolerate the drought better. These plants shed their leaves during dry periods and have deep roots to absorb water from rains long ago. Other plants just kind of pop up when there's rain and then seeds everywhere. So that's how plants adapt to the shortage of water. How about animals? Animals will usually have protection from sand getting into their body, like the camel's fabulous eyelashes. Many desert animals are long and lanky so that they can radiate a lot of heat. You usually won't get many carnivores in the desert, because it's not like there's an abundance of herbivores, but the amount of animal diversity you get is going to be proportional to how much plant life is in your desert. Alright, so what other harshnesses are there? Big spiders, quicksand, sun exposure, you got a lot of heat during the day, a lot of cold during the night. Oh, you got dust storms, which actually seem cooler than they are. Dust storms basically just make the desert harder to grow crops in. They're also a big inconvenience when it comes to roads and the spread of spores, although dust can move mineral nutrients to different regions of the world. There's also flash floods that happen every once in a while because desert land usually isn't the best for absorbing water. So the important thing about all these challenges is how they affect the people living there. The best way for me to go over this is to analyze what happens in real life, and then just go over how that translates into good world building. For the very same reason most plants would die in the desert, humans aren't the best for living in an arid dustscape. A human can usually only survive a few days without water, and in the desert, sweating works really well to cool you down. Excessively well. Sweating is the primary cause of water loss in the desert, so anything you can do to protect yourself from hot winds and the sun will help. This is why people would wear robes that cover them up and seem really hot when they're in the desert. When coming up with how people survive in these types of landscapes, a good idea is to watch a Man vs. Wild episode that takes place in that kind of biome, which may showcase some of the challenges of being there and how a grizzly British man would deal with it. People traveling in certain deserts would have to jump from oasis to oasis and carry water in between. At oases, there'd be infrastructure put in place to care for people's animals and restock on food and water. Goods would also be exchanged fairly often. So as you can see, oases made pretty good hubs for trade. But maybe this could be subverted if different non-ground water-based reservoirs were to be created in your world. Maybe there are sky whales that act as giant floating water balloons that tribes and caravans follow and domesticate. Rivers would also be huge for doing anything in a desert, whether it be living there or traveling there. Now, deserts can be massive, which increases the chance that the cultures it separates will be extremely different and have different resources to trade. The best example of this is with the Empire of Mali, which controlled the trade routes of gold and salt between the northern Islamic kingdoms and the sub-Saharan peoples. If stretches of desert are too vast or harsh, then trade simply won't be able to go on there. Other deserts also had large trade networks running through them, like the Gobi and all the deserts of the Silk Road. Since deserts are often huge and basically act as a barrier for communication between peoples, trade routes through them will exchange ideas and technologies fairly quickly. Okay, so that's the commercial stuff. When it comes to resources, some deserts have a lot of salt and dried up lake beds. Salt in these regions is mostly due to either geothermally heated groundwater coming up into the desert, or buildup as salt is dissolved into water which collects in a low depression. And if I said that was it, you may be thinking, but wait, what about all that oil? The oil reserves in the Middle East don't really owe their existence to the desert itself. All of this plays into how desert societies work, but that doesn't matter if they can't spring up in the first place, so let's talk about desert civilizations. We already talked about how a lot of trade and stuff would go down, but not about broader societies. What would a desert area have to give rise to a civilization as we know them? To cover just the basics, meaning you can live there and sustain agriculture, you would need a source of water throughout the year and a source of nutrients to the soil. A source of water could be a river, like in Egypt, or seasonal snowmelt, or some oases, or some water balloon whales if you're so inclined. A source of nutrients to the soil? Well, that's a hard one. Wide open deserts can be minerally rich, but very poor in organic compounds. That's why the Nile River's silt deposits are so fresh. What often happens is that the surface of a desert gets all salty and nothing can grow on it, but the soil below it is a bit better. Any desert civilization would be able to use stone, clay, or mud as their building materials, which are pretty common. I do suppose a trade city that didn't have access to any of these things could be established in a desert as long as it had easy access to everything it needed, and was in a super good location for trade, because if it weren't, there would be no good reason to live there.
I'd like a glass of water.
Now when it comes to world building, the biggest name in the desert game is Dune. To oversimplify a lot, the planet Arrakis is entirely a desert due to an invasive species that got rid of the water on it. The larval sand trout dig water deep down into the ground to dry up the surface, and once it's dry enough, they grow and become sandworms, which are absolutely badass in every way. Excretions from these species, when mixed with water, create massive bursts that erupt subterranean material to the surface. The chemicals from this become the spice melange, which is a drug that helps facilitate massive scale trade and is in high demand from a lot of people. The most important thing is that Arrakis is the only planet to produce melange. I for one think the world building is really good, especially for being written in the 60s. Like, the natives hold water as sacred and they collect it from the atmosphere. I like that. All of this is exactly what I think narrative world building should be, where the unique aspects of the world and its history build what it is currently. Everything is interconnected and a conflict is set up due to the importance of Arrakis. There's also the Isle Waste from the Wheel of Time and the Great Desert of Araga and the Wasteland of Murgos from the Belgariad. These are a few examples of desert world building in literature. Now, I'm not saying that this is what deserts are and you gotta do this right or it's not gonna be a good world. No, what I am saying is that on Earth, this is generally how deserts work, and if they're different on your world, you need to look at these differences and make sure you analyze how that affects the people and the ecosystems and all that kind of jazz. Now I know a lot of you have constructed worlds already, and it's more than likely that there are some deserts that are not exactly the most realistic. If you don't want to change it, it's your job to either accept a possible inconsistency, which is totally fine, or world build a creative solution that will make up for it. This happened to me in my world while I was researching for this video. And I'm
a gnome, and you've been... No!